These are 15 places scattered across the British Isles where something has gone deeply wrong. Some were abandoned because the ground beneath them collapsed. Others were seized by their own governments and never returned. The history of a few is so dark that locals still lower their voices if you bring up the wrong topic. Many facts you think you know about the places in this video turn out to be completely wrong. We're starting with villages famous for their ghost stories, moving on to ancient ruins, submerged coastlines, the plague and industrial disasters, military seizures, and finally, the most remote abandoned places in the British Isles. Make sure you watch all the way to the end, because the stories get even more intense as we go. Subscribe to the channel before your memories resurface, and let's get started. Part 1. The Haunted Villages. 1. Pluckley, Kent. Pluckley is probably the most famous haunted village in England, and nearly everything people believe about it turns out to be wrong. 5 miles west of Ashford in the Weald of Kent, with a population of 1,080 according to the 2021 census, it looks like nothing more than orchards and a tidy English high street on a summer afternoon. After dark, locals will tell you that you might see considerably more. The claim you hear most often is that Pluckley holds a Guinness World Record as the most haunted village in England, and that is not exactly true. Back in 1989, the Guinness Book of Records included the village on page 20, inside a box titled Most Haunted Village, with a question mark after it. The text described Pluckley as generally thought to be the most haunted, boasting at least 12 spiritus inhabitants. That phrasing tells you everything. It reads as an editorial aside, not an official record. Guinness does not collate country-specific haunting records and has never updated or maintained that listing. And that's when the ghost count starts to fall apart. A peer-reviewed paper published in 2025 by Dr. Simon Morton of the University of the West of England in the journal Folklore traced the entire reputation back to one man. Frederick Sanders, a Pluckley local, wrote a piece for the Kentish Express in 1950 listing 10 ghosts. 10, not 12, not 16. 3 more were invented by the actor Desmond Carrington in a 1962 TV Times Christmas Extra article, which introduced a phantom coach, a monk, and a poltergeist that never appeared in any earlier source. More stories surfaced after 1967, which meant the count swelled from 10 to 12 to 16 depending on who you ask and when you ask them. Each ghost comes with a name and a location, which gives the stories an unusual stickiness. Lady Deering, the Red Lady, haunts the churchyard of St. Nicholas, where she searches for her stillborn child, and she was reportedly buried in a red shroud. The White Lady appears in the Deering Chapel inside St. Nicholas Church. A highwayman meets his end over and over at a crossroads locals call Fright Corner, pinned to a hollow oak with a sword. And the story about a schoolmaster who hanged himself from a tree near the playing fields, that one fell apart completely under Dr. Morton's research. The man's real name was Henry Edgar Martin. He was a papermaker who died in August 1919, and Sanders accidentally merged him with a different Harry Martin, a schoolmaster from nearby Smarden, who died 4 years later in 1923. The Black Horse Inn on the street has stood for over 300 years and featured on Ghost Hunters International in 2008. Staff have reported glasses smashed in locked rooms and cold spots that drift through the bar. The publican does not claim to have seen anything himself. He just keeps the lights on. 2. Prestbury, Gloucestershire. 1.5 miles northeast of Cheltenham sits the village that disputes Pluckley's title. Prestbury's population clocks in at around 7,900 by the 2021 census, which makes it far larger than most people expect for a supposedly quaint, haunted hamlet. The Prestbury Parish Council states that the village lays claim to being the most haunted village in Britain, with over 20 stories of mysterious ghosts, and the rivalry with Pluckley remains entirely informal because Prestbury has no Guinness entry at all. The most well-known apparition is the Black Abbot, a hooded figure in dark robes who surfaces at Easter, Christmas and All Souls' Day, materialising inside St. Mary's Church, crossing the churchyard and vanishing into the wall of Reform Cottage on Deep Street. That thatched building likely served as a medieval tithe barn connected to Lunthony Priory. Photographer Derek Stafford captured a dark figure in the churchyard in 1990, and no one has satisfactorily explained what it shows. Shaw Green Lane brings a different kind of ghost, a spectral horseman supposedly carrying a Wars of the Roses message in 1471 when a Lancastrian archer shot him down. What makes this one stick is that in 1901, a skeleton turned up at Shaw Green with an arrow lodged between the ribs. Nobody has settled whether the ghost story came before or after the bones. People who have lived in Prestbury for generations describe a strange accommodation with the strangeness. Newcomers report the apparitions most often, while long-term residents say you simply stop noticing the cold spots and stop questioning why your dog refuses to walk down certain lanes. You adjust, and eventually you stop talking about it. Part 2. The Ancient and the Archaeological. 3. Wharram, Percy, Yorkshire. Now we leave the living villages behind. Wharram, Percy sits in the Yorkshire Wolds, a deserted medieval settlement that has been empty since the early 1500s, when Baron Hilton evicted the final 4 families to clear the land for sheep. English Heritage manages the site and charges no admission, though reaching it requires a 3/4-mile walk from the car park, much of it steep and muddy. About 40 house foundations mark where a community once lived, and the Church of St Martin still stands partially intact as a Grade 2 star listed ruin. The last service held there took place in 1949, and the tower partially collapsed a decade later. None of that is what makes Wharram, Percy unsettling though. What rattles people is what turned up beneath it. An April 2017 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science reports, led by Simon Mays of Historic England and Alistair Pike of the University of Southampton, examined 137 bones from a pit complex representing at least 10 individuals ranging from age 2 to 50. 76 perimortem knife marks clustered on the head and neck. 17 bones showed signs of low temperature burning, and 6 long bones had been deliberately broken. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains in the 11th to 13th centuries, and strontium isotope analysis confirmed these people were local, not outsiders brought in from elsewhere. 2 explanations emerged from that study. One was starvation cannibalism. The other was anti-revenant practices, rituals designed to stop the dead from rising, a fear well documented in medieval English texts. The authors leaned towards the second interpretation because the knife marks concentrated on heads and necks in a pattern inconsistent with butchering for food. Scholar Stephen Gordon pushed back, pointing out that medieval texts describe male revenants while these bones include women and children. Neither explanation has been ruled out, which means the villagers of Wharram, Percy either ate their dead or mutilated them out of fear. Farming communities in the surrounding area still warn their children to stay away after sunset. 4. Skara Brae, Orkney. On the Orkney Islands, we reach something older than anything else on this list. Skara Brae was occupied from roughly 3180 to 2500 BC, and to put that in proportion, the Great Pyramid of Giza went up around 2580 BC, which means this settlement predates the pyramids by 600 years. Sand buried it for approximately 4,350 years until a storm in 1850 tore the covering away. William Watt, the landowner, dug into the site first and exposed 4 houses, and then archaeologist V. Gordon Child carried out the key systematic excavation between 1928 and 1930. 10 houses survive in total, 8 of them fully excavated, and the population probably never exceeded 50 people. Orkney had no trees, which meant everything went up in stone, and that is exactly why the furniture survived. Each house contained a central stone hearth with a stone dresser opposite the entrance, stone box beds at the sides, and storage boxes sunk into the floor. Covered passageways linked the houses together. Doors could be barred from inside, and the settlement even had a primitive sewer system running beneath it. What drove the people of Skara Brae away remains unknown. The archaeological evidence points to a gradual departure rather than a sudden one, because they took time to bury objects and prepare before leaving. Standing in those houses, you are surrounded by the domestic details of lives that ended before Stonehenge was completed, and nobody left a note explaining why. Skara Brae now forms part of the heart of Neolithic Orkney, a UNESCO World Heritage Site inscribed in 1999. A 2019 risk assessment found the site extremely vulnerable to climate change, and county archaeologist Julie Gibson has warned that 200 years from now, it may be entirely unsustainable to maintain. The same sea that revealed Skara Brae may ultimately reclaim it. Part 3. Claimed by the Sea. 5. Dunwich, Suffolk. The Suffolk coast holds a village that is still disappearing. At the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, Dunwich held approximately 3,000 residents, and by the late 1200s that number had climbed past 4,000, making it the 6th largest town in England. 8 parish churches, 3 chapels, at least 4 religious houses, and 2 hospitals served a population that rivaled the City of London in physical area, though not in population or importance. 116 people live there now, according to the 2021 census, and most of medieval Dunwich lies beneath the North Sea. A catastrophic storm struck on the 1st of January 1286 and began the long collapse, with further storms following in February and December of 1287, then January 1328, 1347 and 1362. Each one dragged more of the town underwater, and the process continues today because each year a little more of the coastline falls into the sea. Marine archaeologist Stuart Bacon located the remains of All Saints' Church on the seabed in 1971, followed by St. Peter's Church in 1973. The Dunwich 2008 project, led by Professor David Sear of the University of Southampton, deployed multi-beam and side-scan sonar to map what has been called the largest medieval underwater site in Europe. And then there is the legend, the one about church bells ringing from beneath the waves during storms. It ranks among the most atmospheric stories in English folklore, and it needs an asterisk. The oldest documented claim dates to 1859 from a master mariner named John Day. Roland Parker, who wrote the definitive Men of Dunwich, said he had never heard any local talk of bells tolling out to sea. And here is what really unravels it. Medieval parish records contain receipts for the sale of bells from St. Nicholas Church to fund sea defences, which rather suggests those bells were salvaged and sold, not left underwater to ring in storms. A beautiful story, and almost certainly not true. 6. Hallsands, Devon. On the Devon coast, the ruins of Hallsands tell a different kind of drowning, one caused entirely by human hands. The 1891 census recorded 159 residents in 37 houses, a working fishing village with no reason to disappear. That changed in April of 1897 when the Board of Trade granted a licence to contractor Sir John Jackson Limited to dredge the offshore shingle bank and supply material for expanding Devonport dockyard at Eyam. Villagers and engineers both raised warnings, and none of them were heeded. 650,000 tonnes of shingle came out at roughly 1,600 tonnes per day, and the protective beach dropped so dramatically that the dredging licence was revoked on the 8th of January 1902. The damage could not be undone. Storm damage worsened every year until easterly gales struck on the 26th of January 1917, and by the next high tide on the 28th, the seawalls broke and the village was effectively gone. One house remained standing. Elizabeth Pretjohn, born in 1884, stayed alone in that last house, a place called Seaview perched above the wreckage, where she survived on eggs and fishing and gave guided tours to the curious. British Pathé filmed a newsreel of her in 1960, and she died in 1964 at the age of 80. Today, the ruins are closed to the public because the cliffs are unstable, and even the viewing platform shut down in October 2022 due to further erosion. Visitors can only look down from the southwest coast path at collapsed walls and empty windows where families once lived. The pub, the reading room, the chapel, all destroyed so that ships could be built somewhere else. Part 4. Plague and Disaster. 7. Eyam, Derbyshire. Eyam in Derbyshire carries a different kind of weight. In 1665, a bale of cloth arrived from London, addressed to the village tailor Alexander Hadfield, and his assistant George Vickers opened it and hung it by the fire to air out the damp. That revived plague-infected fleas hiding in the fabric. Vickers was buried on the 7th of September 1665, the first of many. You will often hear that Eyam had 350 residents and that around 260 of them died. And that version of the story is wrong in a way that actually matters. A 2016 paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, B, by Whittles and Didelot of Imperial College London, established the village's actual population at approximately 700. The death toll of around 260 remains broadly correct, with church records noting 273 victims, but that means roughly a third of the village perished rather than 3/4. The plague also ran for approximately 14 months, from September 1665 to the 1st of November 1666, not within a single year as most accounts claim. What sets Eyam apart from every other plague village in England is the decision that came on the 24th of June 1666, when a formal quarantine was established. 2 clergymen led the effort together, the new rector William Mompesson and his predecessor Reverend Thomas Stanley, who had been removed from his position for refusing to conform to the 1662 Act of Uniformity, but had stayed in the village. That cooperation mattered enormously because the villagers trusted Stanley, not Mompesson the newcomer, and the Earl of Devonshire supplied provisions from outside the cordon. Boundary stones still mark the quarantine perimeter, with holes carved in them that once held coins soaked in vinegar. The payment for food left by outsiders who would not cross the line. Mompesson's well, where supplies were exchanged, now carries Grade 2 listed status. The Riley graves on a hillside outside the village tell the worst of it. Elizabeth Hancock buried 6 of her children and her husband within 8 days in August 1666, dragging the bodies to the edge of her farm and digging each grave herself while neighbours from Stony Middleton watched from a nearby hill, unable to help because of the quarantine. She never contracted the plague. Eyam Museum opens seasonally, and the annual Plague Sunday Memorial Service takes place on the last Sunday of August at Cucklet Delph. Walking through that village, you walk among people who chose to die rather than spread death, not supernatural ghosts, but something far harder to dismiss. 8. Aberfan, South Wales. Now we shift to something harder. Friday, the 21st of October 1966 was the last day before half-term, and the children at Pantglas Junior School in Aberfan had just come back from morning assembly where they had been singing All Things Bright and Beautiful. At approximately 9:13 that morning, a colliery spoil tip on the hillside above the village gave way. 140,000 cubic yards of mining debris slid down onto the school and the surrounding houses, and what followed cannot be softened by careful phrasing. 116 children died, 109 of them inside the school. 28 adults died, 5 of whom were teachers. An entire generation of a village taken in minutes. Lord Justice Edmund Davies, who himself was born 2 miles from Aberfan, chaired the tribunal of inquiry that sat for 76 days and heard 136 witnesses. The report landed on the 3rd of August 1967, and the conclusion was unequivocal. Blame for the disaster rests upon the National Coal Board. 9 NCB staff were named. Tip number 7 had been constructed on ground overlying natural springs that were marked on Ordnance survey maps going back to 1874, and warnings had arrived from every direction between 1960 and 1966. Villagers raised concerns in September 1960. Waterworks engineer D.C.W. Jones flagged problems in July and August of 1963. The deputy borough engineer wrote explicitly about danger from coal slurry being tipped at the rear of the Pantglass schools. The NCB's own engineers acknowledged in March 1964 that the tip posed a danger to the school, and previous slides from Tip 7 had already occurred in May and November of 1963. Nothing changed. And this is where it gets worse. NCB Chairman Lord Robbins skipped Aberfan to attend his investiture as Chancellor of the University of Surrey, then blamed the disaster on natural unknown springs. £500 per deceased child, that is what families received, and they had to sign away their legal rights to get it. £150,000 was taken from the Public Disaster Fund to cover the cost of tip removal, money that was not repaid without interest until 1997 under Tony Blair. The Welsh Government added £2 million more in 2007. The Aberfan Memorial Garden now occupies the ground where the school stood, opened in 1973, and in 2022 the memorial and Bryntaff Cemetery were listed on the Cadbury Register of Parks and Gardens of Special Historic Interest as a Grade 2 star site. Survivors still live in that village, and they have made their wishes clear. Come if you want to understand, but do not come if you want to gawk, because the difference matters here. Part 5. Taken by the Government 9. Imber, Wiltshire. Imber sits on Salisbury Plain, inside what is now the Ministry of Defence's 94,000-acre training area, and it tells the story of a village that was stolen and never given back. On the 1st of November 1943, residents received notice that they had to leave, and they were given 47 days to do it. Roughly 150 people from 38 families packed their belongings and were gone by the 17th of December. Everyone expected to come home. Richard Madigan, a soldier who helped carry out the evacuation, testified under oath to the Defence Lands Committee in the 1970s that the promise of return was made, and the original eviction letter, which resurfaced at those hearings, indicated the same thing. No formal written guarantee has ever been publicly confirmed, though, and that distinction turned out to matter. The war ended over 80 years ago, and nobody went back. St Giles's Church, a Grade 1 listed building from the 13th and 14th centuries, was declared redundant in 2002 and passed to the Church's Conservation Trust in 2005, which spent over £200,000 restoring it by 2009. Volunteer Neil Skelton, who received a British Empire Medal in 2016, leads the Friends of St Giles in opening the church on the few days each year the public is allowed in. Every other building is a ruin. Bullet holes pock the walls from decades of fighting in built-up areas. Training, roofs have caved in, and the village opens to visitors only about 20 days per year, clustered around Easter, an August bus rally, Remembrance Sunday, and the Christmas period. Descendants of original residents make the trip and walk through what remains of their family homes, knowing they cannot stay. A 2023 archaeological dig by Wessex Archaeology and Operation Nightingale, a Ministry of Defence programme for veterans, pulled abandoned artefacts from the old village pond and described the find as a Salisbury Plain Pompeii. 10. Tyneham, Dorset. Tyneham in Dorset tells a nearly identical story with one heartbreaking addition. On the 16th of November 1943, roughly 225 people from 102 properties received orders to evacuate, with about 28 days to comply. The area was needed for firing ranges that remain active to this day. Before they left, someone pinned a note to the church door, and the authorship is still disputed between Evelyn Bond, wife of the Lord of the Manor, and Helen Taylor, a seamstress who claimed to be the last person to walk out. Taylor died in May 1999 at 97. The note read, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many of us have lived for generations to help win the war to keep men free. We shall return one day, and thank you for treating the village kindly." They never returned. A compulsory purchase order went through in 1948, and the valley sold for £30,000. St Mary's Church, dating to the 13th century, and the schoolhouse from 1856 both serve as museums now, and received Grade 2 listed status in December 2020. The rest of the village crumbles under military ownership as part of the Lulworth Ranges. A red phone box stands near the church and looks original, but it is an authentic type replacement fitted with period wartime notices because the actual 1929 kiosk was destroyed during filming of the movie Comrades in 1985. Tyneham opens far more often than Imber, roughly 143 days a year, drawing around 100,000 visitors annually. On the 29th of April 2025, Peter Wellman died in Swanage at the age of 100. He was the last surviving person to have lived in Tyneham as a resident, and his funeral took place at Corfe Castle. The village remains frozen in 1943, waiting for people who grew old somewhere else and whose grandchildren now visit a place they have never been allowed to call home. 11. Capel Celyn, North Wales. Beneath the waters of Lynn. Celyn Reservoir in North Wales lie the remains of Capel Celyn, a village that was drowned so that Liverpool could have water. The Liverpool Corporation Act received royal assent on the 1st of August 1957, pushed through as a private bill that bypassed Welsh planning authorities entirely. Not one of the 36 Welsh members of Parliament voted for the bill. 35 actively opposed it. 1 abstained, and the bill passed 166 to 117, carried entirely by English votes. 67 people lived in the Tryweryn Valley. A post office, a school, a chapel, and 12 farms were demolished, and 8 bodies were disinterred from the graveyard and moved. The dam was completed in August of 1965, and the official opening on the 21st of October drew Plaid Cymru demonstrators who cut the microphone wires and burned a Union flag. Dry spells still expose the village. When water levels drop, stone walls and foundations push through the surface, evidence of the community that was erased. The political fallout reshaped Wales entirely because Plaid Cymru won its first parliamentary seat the following year, when Gwynfor Evans took Carmarthen, and the militant group Mudiad Amddiffyn Cymru bombed a transformer at the dam site in February 1963. Liverpool City Council issued a formal apology in October 2005, and the Wales Act of 2017 devolved water powers to ensure another Tryweryn could never happen. Ask locals about visiting the reservoir, and some will welcome you. Others will tell you that you are standing on stolen land, drinking stolen water. Both responses are accurate. Part 6. Isolation and Extinction. 12. St Kilda, Scotland. More than 40 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, past the edge of everything, lies the archipelago of St Kilda, the most remote part of the British Isles. On the 29th of August 1930, the remaining 36 residents, 13 men, 10 women, 8 girls, and 5 boys from 10 households boarded HMS Harebell and left. They had asked to be taken off. Survival had become something they could no longer manage. A condition called the 8-day sickness killed the majority of newborns. Between 1855 and 1876, the island's registrar, Duncan Kennedy, recorded 41 infant deaths out of 56 births, a 73% mortality rate that is staggering even by Victorian standards. Neonatal tetanus was the cause. Traditional practice called for treating the umbilical cord with fulmar oil, and for decades that oil took the blame. But research by P. Stride, published in the Journal of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, tested 40 samples and found every one of them negative for the tetanus bacterium. The oil itself turned out to be innocent. What it likely did was seal bacteria from the filthy living environment, earthen floors, and animal manure against the wound, creating the airless conditions tetanus needs to grow. Reverend Angus Fiddes arrived in the 1890s, changed the birthing practices, and ended the epidemic. The last recorded case came on the 18th of August 1891. Isolation brought another affliction called the boat cold, Natan na Gol in Gaelic, meaning the stranger's cold. Whenever a ship arrived from the mainland, virtually every islander fell sick. Modern research points to rhinovirus as the cause. because the community's total separation from the outside world meant they carried zero immunity to infections that mainlanders shrugged off without thinking. Stone black houses still stand on St Kilda with their roofs fallen in but their walls intact, and stone cleats, built for storing seabirds, dot the hillsides by the hundreds. The Ministry of Defence has operated a tracking station on the island since 1957, currently run by Connecticut, which completed a £40 million redevelopment around 2022. St Kilda holds a distinction no other British site can claim. It is the United Kingdom's only mixed natural and cultural UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscribed in stages in 1986, 2004 and 2005. Visitors who arrive by boat walk through a community that asked to leave because life there had become too hard. The silence on those islands goes deeper than quiet. Part 7. Dark Histories. 13. Pendle, Lancashire. Pendle Hill rises 557 metres above the Lancashire landscape, visible for miles in every direction, and the villages scattered around its base, Newchurch in Pendle, Roughly, Barley, Blacko, carry a history that should provoke anger rather than entertainment. 12 people from the area around that hill were accused of witchcraft in 1612. Trials took place at the Lancaster Assizes on the 18th and 19th of August, before judges Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley. 9 of the 12 were hanged at Gallows Hill, Lancaster, on the 20th of August. Janet Preston had already been hanged at York Assizes on the 29th of July because she lived across the border in Yorkshire. Elizabeth Southerns, known as Old Demdike and approximately 80 years old, died in a cell at Lancaster Castle before the trial reached her. Alice Gray was the only one acquitted. Most of the accused were poor, elderly and female, with one glaring exception. Alice Nutter was a wealthy widow from Roughly, and modern scholars believe she was likely a Catholic recusant whose relatives John Nutter and Robert Nutter were Jesuit priests executed for their faith. She may have been attending a secret Catholic service on Good Friday 1612 and chosen silence at trial to protect fellow worshippers rather than save herself. A memorial statue went up in Roughly 400 years later, in 2012. Accusations ranged from murder by witchcraft to causing illness to making a pact with the devil, and not a single piece of evidence would survive scrutiny in a modern courtroom. Confessions came through exhaustion and manipulation, and the witnesses included children and personal rivals nursing grudges. Thomas Potts, the clerk of the court, documented the trial in The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, published in 1613, and scholar Marion Gibson has described Potts as an active and selective reporter, which is a polite way of calling the document propaganda. The gathering that sealed their fate took place at Malkin Tower, the Demdike family home, on Good Friday 1612, and when Magistrate Roger Nowell learned of the meeting, his inquiry on the 27th of April led to 8 more arrests. Historian Stephen Pumphrey argues that the supposed plot to blow up Lancaster Castle was fabricated entirely by the magistrates. In January 2024, a parliamentary petition to pardon the Pendle witches crossed 12,000 signatures. Walking those paths today, you walk where they walked, accused of impossible crimes by neighbours who feared what they could not explain. 14. Hampton Gay, Oxfordshire. Our 14th village is one you have almost certainly never heard of, and that is precisely why it belongs here. Hampton Gay in Oxfordshire is a genuinely deserted village with an atmosphere that has no equivalent anywhere else in England. Christmas Eve. 1874 brought a catastrophe when a Great Western Railway train derailed at nearby Shipton on Cherwell, killing 34 people and injuring 69. The village's paper mill became a temporary mortuary where 26 bodies were laid out for identification. Local legend holds that the residents of the Elizabethan manor house refused to shelter survivors, and a curse was placed on the building. 13 years later, in 1887, the manor burned to a shell and was never rebuilt. Those skeletal ruins, a scheduled monument on Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register, stand alone in a meadow beside a tiny ruined church, accessible only by footpath. Reports of ghostly children in the churchyard have circulated for decades. Hampton Gay combines a cursed ruin, a Victorian train disaster, and genuine desolation in a way no other place on this list manages. Almost nobody visits, no tourism guide mentions it, and the village simply sits in its field, empty and unexplained. 15. Tide Mills, East Sussex. Our last village sits on the coast between Newhaven and Seaford in East Sussex. Tide Mills started as a tidal flour mill in 1761, and a workers' village grew up around it to house over 60 residents. A militia mutiny in 1795 saw troops steal flour from the mill, and 5 of the ringleaders were executed for it. During the First World War, the site housed a Royal Naval Air Service seaplane station, but by the early 20th century, conditions for the people living there had deteriorated badly. No piped water, only shared standpipes and earth closets instead of plumbing. Seaford Council condemned the remaining houses as unfit for human habitation in 1936, and that designation held. The last residents were forcibly removed between 1939 and 1940, when the beach was requisitioned for wartime defences, and every building was demolished. Crumbling walls, exposed foundations, and an abandoned railway platform now stretch along the beach with a lighthouse standing beyond them, all of it freely accessible. The condemnation of an entire village as unfit for human habitation carries a particular sting that separates Tide Mills from everything else on this list. People did not leave because of ghosts or plague or government seizure. They were told their homes were too degraded for anyone to live in, and then every structure was knocked flat. If you found this video worth your time, subscribe, because there is more coming and these stories matter.